Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Colapercio. I'm the Deputy Director for the Association for a Better New York. It's nice to meet some of you and see some familiar faces today. Thank you for joining us today for this policy brief on ranked choice voting, an important measure that will appear on your ballots on November 5th as one of the proposed revisions to the New York City Charter. You are all here as members or friends of the ABNY Young Professionals Network, and we're delighted to see you. The YP Network is one that provides educational programming and unique experiences throughout New York City to foster civic engagement for the next generation of the city's leaders. Help us spread the word by sharing our invitations, liking us on social media, and suggesting new members for the group. We're on Facebook as ABNY and at ABetterNY on Twitter and Instagram. So tonight is going to work. We're going to have two speakers. To begin with, we'll have Dr. Carlo Prato. He's the assistant professor at Columbia University, and he'll provide an overview of ranked choice voting. Next, we'll hear from Susan Lerner, the executive director of Common Cause New York, who will demonstrate ranked choice voting, or RCV, with a mock ballot and election using the system. Before I turn it over to Dr. Prato, I'd like to share a little bit about him. He teaches in the Department of Political Science at Columbia and previously held the same position at the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University. He earned his PhD in economics from Northwestern and was a Campbell National Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He specializes in research at the intersection of economics and political science. Thank you for presenting to us today. We're grateful for your time and your expertise. And so will the young professionals please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for coming. I know you have lots of options. Awesome weather. Okay, before I begin, rules of engagement. I am an academic, and I tend to spend most of my time with other academics. That leads to a deterioration of my social skills. Okay, so I'm not particularly trained on how to be clear. I'm also used during my presentation to have people jumping in my throat and trying to poke holes in the arguments that I'm trying to make. So, for both of you, please, do feel free to stop me and ask questions in the middle of the presentations. I don't mind. Okay? It is virtually impossible. It's very unlikely that none of the things that I say will be confusing. All right. On top of that, as you can hear, I speak funny. So raise your hand and say, "Wait, what?" Okay, and that's how I would like to roll. Okay. Right. So why are we here? We are here because in a few weeks. In a few days, we are going to have to decide whether or not to change the rules that are used to select a number of important public elected offices in New York City. Okay? Question one is going to ask us whether we want to move from a runoff system to a ranked choice vote system for the in the primary election for the mayor, the public advocate, the Comptroller, and city council official, as well as special elections.
And Borough President.
So, this is a complicated question. We are trying to understand the consequence of a change in institutions. So what I'm going to do is to sort of inoculate you against a set of questions. Then I'm going to provide you with an overview of the system rules. What we're trying to, what happens if we decide as New Yorkers to transition to that system. Then I'm going to discuss the existing literature, or what I was able to find, what I think I know, about this type of change. So the likely consequences of this change. There's a lot of things we really don't know. There's a few things about which we can make educated conjectures. Then I'm going to sort of add a caveat that is specific to the university case. economics is often labeled as business science. Now, since I became a political scientist, I can tell you that the real business science is political science. One of the reasons why political science is the real business science is that the answer to the question, what's the optimal electoral system, is none. Okay? We actually have theorems that say, suppose we start with an electoral system, we have to make some sort of collective decisions. We start imposing requirements that seem absolutely natural. You want some consistency, you want to be able to make a decision. Things like that. Very soon, you end up with the following answer. The only system that satisfies this very reasonable set of requirements is a dictatorship. Okay, so you have to, something has to give. Every time you think about changing or designing an electoral system, you have to know that there exists a trade-off. You cannot just try, well, I'm going to be smarter than everyone else. No, those trade-offs will exist. You have to operate within those constraints. One way to think about these trade-offs is the one between representation and decisiveness. If you want a system to represent, to provide voters with lots of choices and to represent multiple points of views, then it's going to make it hard for us to reach a decision. In the end, we have to elect a man, right? We have to elect an executive. Another way to think, another trade-off, another dimension in which there is a tension, is going to be the one between choice and complexity. If we want lots and lots of alternatives, we have to accept that our ballot and the system that will translate those votes into an outcome will have to involve some complexity, some more complexity. Now, here in the United States, so the classic dichotomy that academics use is the one between plurality rule, which is the system that Americans are most familiar with, and proportional rule. Plurality has always been thought to be relatively simple in terms of ballot. In the end, there's a list of people, pick one. And highly decisive. It's relatively simple to obtain an outcome. Whoever gets more votes wins. As Americans, we inherit this system, this way to think about selection of officials from England. Now, there are a few issues well known with plurality. First, in some sense, their outcomes lack legitimacy and disproportionality. It produces a lot of disproportionality. You can win an election by just getting 35% of the vote. And on average, actually, that's what happened in 2008.
I guess that. Just a little loud, please. It drops off sometimes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there's a mic here, so I should stay here. How about now? No, but I was reading coffee. Now okay, so if you use plurality, you can obtain outcomes that seem to be undesirable, that seem to weaken the mandate of those elected. For example, in 2005, in the United Kingdom, they won the election. They obtained 55% of the seats in the parliament. It's a resounding majority. But they only got 35% of the votes cast. Okay, and this happens over and over again if you use plurality. And there is a sense in which not having the mandate of the majority of the voters sort of reduces the legitimacy of those candidates. There is also an issue of reduction of choice that voters have. There are powerful strategic incentives, both on the voter and the candidate side, that discourage candidates from entering. So think about a race where there are already two relatively extreme candidates, and there is a more moderate candidate that contemplates entering the race. And this person may decide not to do it in order to facilitate the victory of one of the candidates if this person has a preference over the two. And this is the story about Bloomberg proposed decision to enter in the 2016 race. That's one of the ways in which newspapers report about.
This problem also exists on the voter side. Among multiple candidates, voters need to think about whether the option that they are planning to support have really a chance. And if not, whether they would be better off by choosing a candidate that may not fully representing the reviews might actually have a better shot at winning. Okay, so the idea is not to waste your vote. And this we have a sense as political scientists that this is not entirely desirable. It would be better if people could choose the alternative that they like best. And then the issue that I described about discouraging entry into candidacy is particularly relevant for candidates that are women or minorities. We have evidence that I find incredible that claims that women and minority candidates are less likely to enter and less likely to win elections under plurality system compared to proportional rule. And then there's a set of things that people are concerned about, which has to do with negative campaigns and the very intense competition that plurality elections sometimes generate. And the sort of perverse incentives on the type of things the candidates are going to say. If we think about the United States, many people are worried that elections are now just games in which each candidate tries to demotivate the supporters of the other side by saying really, really mean and nasty things about them. And this is not specifically an issue of plurality, it extends to other systems. There are reasons to suspect that those issues are exacerbated under plurality rule because of the very personal nature of the races. So people have already thought about these issues and they come up with possible solutions. One of them is the additional runoff stage. Okay, so rather than electing simply whoever gets most votes, we're going to say, look, we need candidates to clear a certain threshold. If no one does, we're going to take the top two candidates and have another election. Now, this solves certain issues. It doesn't solve others. So if you think about the primary election between the runoff primary between Green and Ferrer in 2001, that was not an election that was characterized by complete lack of personal attacks and nastiness. It's also expensive because to organize another round of election, you need to use public resources. You're not guaranteed that the same number of people will show up, and indeed, typically they do not. Voters get tired. One thing that definitely runoff don't not do is to address this issue. So you would think that by decoupling the moment in which you elect a candidate to the moment in which you just express a preference for your favorite candidate, you would reduce the severity of strategic voting. And we know that that's not true. If you are familiar with French politics, you would know that there is a lot of strategic calculation when it comes to voting for a presidential candidate in France. And last time they had an election, they almost sent to the runoff the two most extreme candidates. There is a lot of strategic. The runoff election, if anything, produce as much strategic voting as plurality. So another solution, and an election that will be essentially asked to choose between this and this solution. Another solution is to change the way, change the type of information that we obtain from voters. So one way to think about the issue of plurality is that it's a really blunt tool. We are going to ask a voter for one and only one piece of information. The fundamental idea of RCB is let's try to elicit more information from voters and try to use it. So instead of casting a ballot for your favorite candidate, under rankers voting, which is also known as persistent runoff, the ballot is an entire ranking over a certain number of candidates. So each person casts a ballot that ranks more than one candidate. In New York, it's gonna be 5. Okay, you're gonna have the option to run at least, at most 5 candidates. It's an option. So then, what happens is that we start with first preference votes. We begin counting them. And we ask ourselves the following question. Is there a candidate that obtains more than 50% of all first preference votes, of all that was first ranked by more than 50% of the voters? If the answer is yes, we stop. And the election isn't that different from plurality. If the answer is no, instead, we move to a second step. And this is what happened in the second step. We take the candidate that receives the lowest number of first preferences, we remove that candidate from the competition, and then we take the second preference votes cast by the voters to that candidate, and we allocate to the other candidates. Okay, so we change the vote value. And then, okay, so this is what we do. We eliminate a candidate and we reallocate votes. And then we have a different vote count. The tallies are different. Candidates received voters from the ballots of the worst performer in terms of first preferences. And then we count again, and we ask ourselves the same question. Is there someone that gets more than 50% of the vote? If the answer is no, we continue. And I guarantee you, it's a promise, that at some point we stop. At some point we remain with 2 candidates, and that's essentially a runoff, which is why we call this thing instant runoff. Yes?
So just to be clear, it's going to go on and like, not indefinitely, but if they don't get 50%, it just keeps going and going and going?
Yeah. But you don't need to be involved in the counting, right? You cast your vote as a voter, and then you wait. I actually haven't looked at any evidence about it, but I don't suspect that there is a substantial increase in the time that it takes. The technology that you need to process those ballots is a little bit more sophisticated.
Is the 50% number a rule of thumb, or is there a drawback to say 60 or 70%?
You can do more than 50%. There is no problem. Sometimes you're not going to elect a candidate. Right, so if you have only 2 candidates that reach the last stage, there's only 2 of them, and you count their ballots, and one candidate obtained 50.1% of the votes, and the other one is 49.9. If your requirement to be elected is 60%, you're not going to elect anyone. I consider that to be a problem. So there is a reason why the threshold of 50% is important. With runoff, you're actually have more flexibility. For example, in your primaries, the threshold is 40%. There are other runoff elections that are only triggered if no one gets above 50%. But for this, there is less. You have to use. Good.
Can you explain one more time? So the candidate that gets the last, or like the least amount of votes,
Yeah.
their second preference?
The second preference of the voters who rank them as first, who rank these candidates first.
The last.
Yeah, suppose I'm ranked last. Actually, I have an example. You don't need to suppose anything. I'll show you. There's another question.
Can you explain what runoff is again, as opposed to?
Yes. So under a runoff system, I'm going to run an election like plurality. There's going to be a bunch of candidates. Each voter is going to cast a ballot for one specific candidate. Then we're going to count the votes. If no one, in the case of New York, means no one is above 40% of the votes, you're going to have another election which is restricted to the top 2 candidates in the first round.
Is there any information around what percentage of voters in a ranked choice voting system would choose more than one candidate versus ranked?
Excellent question. So what I know is that the website Vox ran a mock primary. So they asked a bunch bunch of voters to vote in an hypothetical democratic primary election that involved 8 candidates. I think it was the 8 top polling candidates of that was done a month or 2 ago. And then they looked at these candidates, and if I remember correctly, about 70% of those who participated in that experiment cast more than one, ranked more than one candidate. We return to that because these are called the problem that you're alluding, that you're already foreseeing, is called exhaustion. And it is a problem if there is one specific thing that you care about.
Well, and I'd be curious too about demographics of who is and who is not ranking more than one, and if that excludes.
Excellent question. So can I? So there is a paper that tells you exactly that. Right, we'll do it later. So yes, there is evidence, and the evidence seems to be against the evidence that researchers do not find a substantial bias against certain groups. The propensity of, say, women and minorities to rank as candidates is the same as white males. The demographic gradients, the propensity to rank one candidate doesn't seem to be strong, if it exists. Researchers could not detect. This would be a problem if those effects would be. Yes?
What's the process to reallocate the votes, when someone has like fewer votes? How does that happen? Like, where do the votes go?
Yes, I'm going to give you an example that which shows you exactly that, which is going to answer exactly the question. So, let's imagine that we are trying to run an election with 4 candidates, okay? These, by the way, are suspiciously similar to the top 4 profiles on Instagram. But these are hypothetical candidates, right? So there's one called CR7, there's another one called Ariana G, then there's another one called Wayne The Rock, and then there's another one called Selena G. Okay, we have to choose one among those 4 candidates. This is how the ballot is going to look like, and this is how I'm going to fill the ballot. Okay, I like Ariana. So Ariana is my favorite candidate. I am not a fan of CR7, so CR7 is going to be ranked last. And between The Rock and Selena, after some introspection, I decided to rank The Rock second. Because this is how I feel about those candidates, and this is how I vote. Now suppose that there's 100 people like me. We all cast a vote. And remember, if I had just ranked 1, 2, 3 and I had left CR7's box blank, that my vote would have been still valid. It would have been a choice. I could have done that. But you know, I'm civically minded, so I did all the work of ranking those candidates. So now we have 100 votes, and we only consider the first ranked candidates. So we are counting the numbers in which each candidate received 1 on that box. And it turns out that CR7 has 40 votes, Ariana has 30, The Rock has 18, and Selena has 12. Okay? Now, because there's 100 votes, and the top performer has 40 votes, we are not going to stop. No one wins at this stage. So what do we do? Who's the worst performer? Very good. So we're going to look at the second choice of the 12 people who chose to rank Selena first. Okay? So we eliminate Selena. We look at, we go down on the ranking of those 12 votes, those 12 ballots. And we learn that of those 12 voters, 6 ranked Ariana second. We're going to give those votes to Ariana. 2 ranked The Rock second. We're going to give those 2 votes to The Rock. 1 ranked CR7 second, we're gonna give that vote to CR7. Okay, so we're gonna add those votes and relook at the totals. Okay, so now we have 56 plus 41, 97 votes. And no one clears the 50% bar.
So now
Okay, you need, okay. Now, we have to drop the rock. So what do? There's 18 voters who ranked the rock first. We're gonna look at the second preference of those voters. And there's 2 voters who ranked Selena first and then ranked the rock second. With those 2 voters, we have to look at the third ranked candidate. Okay, so we eliminate the rock, there's just 2. Now, we are using majority. One of these 2 is gonna win. If we had 60%, we wouldn't know. Okay, so CR7 has a 5 votes advantage over Ariana. So we're open, we're looking at the ballot, and we learned that, you know that I was one of them. 8 voters ranked, 8 of the 18 voters ranked Ariana second. Only 1 ranked CR7 second. We don't care about the rest, right? So either they're empty or they will cast for candidates that we already eliminated. And then we're going to look at these 2 ballots, the Selena, the Rock voters. And we look at the third preference of those 2 voters. One ranked CR7 third, the other one left that spot empty. So we're going to give 8 votes to Ariana, and we're going to give 2 votes to CR7. Okay? Ariana wins. By 2 votes.
I think this is like a waste of time and it unnecessarily inflates people.
Inflates.
Inflates maybe a candidate that shouldn't be voted.
Okay, so why shouldn't the candidate be voted?
Because it's not the first vote, it's a bunch of different votes. I think that.
Very good. So, if you put yourself in the shoes of that voter, you might think carefully about whether you want to even rank some of the candidates. Remember at the beginning I said, I really don't know how I feel about CR7. I really don't like that. If I left my vote, my ballot blank, and I'd not written number 4 there, I would have hurt CR7. Because there is a situation in which they might have gotten to even the last, even down my ballot. But it's a good point. What's the political legitimacy of a third choice? So the question is whether you think that in this election, we should just have elected CR7, whether we should have had a runoff. And based on the outcome of this election, you cannot predict the outcome of a runoff. CR7 might have won. If you just ask people to choose between CR7 and Ariana. So, as a voter, you need to think about whether those additional complexity in the ballot is compensated by a number of things that I'm going to discuss. But it adds complexity. I agree. And there is a question of what's the additional legitimacy of this procedure over time. Right, so one way to rephrase what you're saying is like, well, you're electing people that were using third preference votes. Maybe they actually didn't like that candidate that much. It's possible. Yeah.
So to get on a ballot, my understanding is you just have to be nominated by your party in the US?
No. So, yes, you're right, but we are. Question 1, the ballot, the proposal you have to vote on introduces this system in a primary election. So this is the nomination procedure.
Right. So practically, if you were going to be voting in a ranked choice vote, would your options be basically which party ranked would you like? I mean,
No.
This is for primary election.
So we are
To get
talking.
on the ballot, you have to petition.
I see. would just be for ranking people within the same party.
Yes.
So
yes.
far,
Each
so
there are
far.
8 parties in New York City. Each party is going to be forced by law to use this system in the primary election. This is a problem of, so this creates a problem of taking the evidence that we have about ranked choice voting and apply to New York City. Because in most places, ranked choice voting is used in the general election. What your question tells me that what you had in mind in this example was a general election, not a primary.
It just seems that there has to be like a level of similarity between the candidates to be able to rank them in a meaningful way versus, you know, ranking Green Party versus Democrat versus Republican or whatever. But that
Okay.
doesn't seem to be, that's not what we're doing.
No, if that's what you think, then you probably like the fact that this system is not extended to the general election. So, question 1 is just about the primary, not about the general.
Yeah.
For the general, we still have plurality. Alright, so Ariana gets elected. The reason why Ariana got elected here is that she was much better than CR7 at attracting second preference votes. Okay? That's the takeaway, the main takeaway from this story. Okay, so New York is not the first place where ranked choice voting is being adopted. There's a bunch of experiences in various American cities. Most importantly, Maine had just voted a constitutional amendment that forces the adoption of RCV for all state and federal primary elections, as well as federal general elections. So in this upcoming primary election for the Democratic Party, if you are a resident of Maine, you're going to use ranked choice voting. Even more important, the winner of the Academy Award is currently chosen using ranked choice voting. So a shortcut is: do I like the outcome of? Do I agree with recent Academy Awards? Yes, no, and that might be something. Yes.
With a voter who ranks in an incomplete way, so you're going with partial ranking, what happens?
That vote gets discounted.
To whatever extent they rank.
Yeah. So if you leave some candidates unranked, it is possible that your ballot will not be used for determination of a candidate.
Your ballot does not exclude. Your vote counts. Your number one choices count. It's your option to rank up to 5 or only 1. But your ballot will count. It won't be thrown out.
It won't contribute to the determination of a final winner. You're right. It's the two things are different.
You vote for as your first choice.
Yes. So we are back to the question that I had before, which was about exhaustion. So and this is the last point of the claims that people make about ranked choice voting. So you cannot win an election with ranked choice voting without having a majority of the votes cast, and that is not true. Because if sufficient number of voters don't rank enough candidates, you can win the election with less than 50% of the total number of ballots cast. We can disagree about the normative implication of it, but that is a fact. Indeed, in this example, Ariana won with 46 votes, not 51. There's another question. Yes.
Yeah, going back to the slide that had the examples of success, I'm curious how many of these other examples of ranked choice voting have occurred in local systems that are very much still controlled by party elite. Because I can imagine party bosses in Brooklyn and others restricting the number of candidates who are able to be a choice.
If that's your concern, my guess is that you should be in favor of this change.
Yes.
They
Well-
can't restrict the number of people who can get on the ballot. So if you petition, you can get on the ballot. But yeah,
Yes.
It's easier. That
Generally,
this
the
system
party
reduces
bosses
the
will be
influence of
Yes.
party
Yeah.
bosses.
Right, and this would be a check on that.
yes, yeah.
That's the claim.
And would this extend to judicial elections?
No, judicial elections are state
talking about question one?
Yes.
Yeah. So I am being told to stop taking questions. So let me quickly go over the arguments that were made in favor of ranking system. So I already talked about the last one. Right, so one argument is, well, plurality, we often win without majority of the votes. With ranches voting, we're guaranteed that that's not the case. Not entirely true, but you're substantially increasing the likelihood that the winner of the election will have been ranked, so explicitly indicated by majority of the voters. You can still have. The first is that it encourages moderation, so it reduces your incentive to run negative campaigns. Why? Because now, all of a sudden, we have to compete for the second preference. So you cannot be very decisive, like CR7 in my example, because then you might lose. So CR7 should not attack, should not run a bunch of negative ads against Ariana, because it doesn't necessarily help. There is not a lot of sort of hard evidence about this claim, but there is anecdotal evidence from Ireland which uses a similar system. I'm not going to explain the differences because it's going to take me half an hour. But the idea is that in Ireland, the big loser of the cousin of the system is Sinn Féin, which is a party with a very strong radical identity and history of being essentially the political arm of IRA. Another, the twin idea of this is that it encourages civility. Voters should perceive that campaigns are less negative. Yes, and we have some evidence that that's true, and I find that evidence convincing. Voters report that the civility of the campaign is actually a bit higher in the places where those measures have been adopted. The third argument, remember the discouraging fact that I described to you. There is a claim that it should actually improve representativity. If women and people of color are primarily discouraged under plurality to run, then RCV should encourage that. And there is some evidence that it does. I don't find that entirely persuasive. But let's say that it would be hard for me to believe that it discourages, that it has the opposite effect. And we can discuss it. It eliminates the issue of vote splitting. Right? That's true by definition. You're no longer concerned about splitting your vote between two candidates that you like. Your only problem is to choose who to rank first. But you don't have to worry too much about the issue of supporting the one that has more chances, because if the candidate that you rank first turns out to be not terribly popular among voters, your second preference is going to be used. And there is this problem of exhaustion, and there is actually evidence that this is an issue. It happens. It's not impossible that the winner under RCV will actually not receive the majority of candidates. Yes. Sorry, I did not the question.
Can I just counter that though, because I think you're leaving out something important, which is that in our current system with runoffs, the exhaustion is actually much greater than the exhaustion that would happen with this, because most people don't come back and vote again in a runoff 2 weeks later.
I agree,
So
but I'm not disputing that claim. I agree with that
you should
claim.
mention that, because I think it's important.
Some of the questions that we have here will be addressed by Susan when she gets up, so I would encourage us to just wrap this portion up. We'll get Susan up there, she might have some clarity for you, and then we can do questions for both afterwards. That does sound. Thank you both.
All right. I'm just going to read this out, and while Susan gets ready for her mock, you can read it, and I can take questions about it. Okay? Do I need to read? Okay. No, so yes, I have one thing that I want to say. First, the only evidence that I described is not entirely portable, because RCV is usually adopted in the context of non-partisan primary or general election. this is a primary. Maybe you're not that concerned about any of these things when it comes to primary elections. Who knows? So, even though I'm not going to tell you how to vote on this question, I think I can say that if your main concern is the representation of minority candidates and women, if that was my primary concern, my top priority, I would probably vote in favor of the measure. If my primary concern was the negativity of electoral campaigns, especially primary elections, I would probably vote in favor of this measure. Worried about the influence of the machine, it's less clear because as a scientist, I want evidence, and there isn't much. If your main concern is the lack of programmatic clarity, the candidates under the current system say confusing things to you, and there's already too many, then I would think about this twice, because it's likely to increase the number of candidates. And with that, I'm writing this to Susan.
I just think by the show of questions that we have about this just reiterates how important it is that we're having this conversation, and I hope you will take it back to your friends and your colleagues. And we are recording this event, so we'll be able to share some information with you beyond this, and thank you for being here. I will do a brief intro of Susan. We're excited to get started with our mock election, but it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Lerner. She is responsible for many things at Common Cause New York, including setting the priorities, strategizing, lobbying, serving as a spokesperson, leading the entire staff, and now I'm out of breath just thinking about everything that she has to do day to day. Prior to Common Cause, she led the California Clean Money campaign and was a litigator for nearly 20 years as a member of both the New York and California bars. She holds degrees from the University of Chicago and the New York University Law School. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to shine additional light on this issue, and we'll take questions at the end, okay?
Thanks. So, why is New York City considering ranked choice voting? Right, we've talked about other cities which have ranked choice voting. Oh, and as I'm speaking, we're going to pass out a sample ballot. And I'm going to ask you to fill in your choices. Before I get into sort of my presentation, how many of you go to ice cream stores? And what do you do, ma'am, when you're out of your first ice cream choice? Do you go home? And you picked a very popular flavor for your second choice. And they're out of that too. It's a hot Sunday at the end of the weekend. What do you do? There you go, you've just ranked your ice creams. And that's what we're asking you to do today. Ranking is something we all do relatively intuitively. The process for the voters is pretty straightforward because, as I said, it's something we all do intuitively. Ask any 10-year-old or 12-year-old boy who his favorite baseball player is, and they'll be able to rank their top choices. The complications come in the computations, which are done by computer, and we're going to show you after you've ranked your choices, we're going to collect the ballots, and we're going to do the rounds, and then show you how it works. But the important thing is, why New York City? Why are we thinking about ranked choice voting for New York City? Is there anything peculiar about our election context which makes this an interesting choice for us as New Yorkers? We know it has been road tested. San Francisco has had it for 15 years, Oakland for 10, the two other new California cities, Santa Fe adopted it for its mayoral races, and they liked it so much that they talked Las Cruces into adopting ranked choice voting, and now Albuquerque is considering it. Minneapolis has run 3 election cycles with ranked choice voting, and St. Paul. And the results have been interesting. In the Bay Area, what we are seeing is a situation somewhat similar to the situation demographically that we're seeing in Brooklyn. Both Oakland and San Francisco, the number of African Americans has dropped fairly precipitously. over the last 10 years because of housing issues. Sound familiar? And yet, the number of African-American elected officials in both of those two cities in their city councils and San Francisco as the Board of Supervisors has stayed steady. And in fact, San Francisco just voted in their first African-American woman mayor with ranked choice voting. In Minneapolis, ranked choice voting has helped to diversify the city council. But again, we're New York. We are a different situation. There is no question that if New York's voters decide to adopt ranked choice voting, it will triple the number of voters who use the system in the United States. So it's important to really think through, what does it mean and why would we want to consider it here? So at Common Cause, we looked at our experience as New York City residents in terms of electing our representatives. And what we found is in the past 10 years, 66% of our elections in New York City are multi-candidate elections. And that's true particularly in the primaries. And of those 66% that have more than 2 candidates running, 2/3 of those elections, the winner was chosen with less than 50% of the vote. 30% of the multi-candidate primaries were won with less than 40% of the vote, and almost 10% of the multi-candidate primaries were won with less than 30% of the vote. How many of you here voted in the special election for public advocate? Do you remember how many candidates we had? 17. It's hard to imagine ranked choice voting encouraging more people to run. And the domino effect from Jumaane Williams being elected as public advocate for in the special election meant that there was a special election to replace him in the city council. Jumaane Williams was considered to be the walk-away winner with 36% of the votes cast. And in the special election to replace him, we had 8 candidates running. They were very similar ideologically to each other. There were a number of women, there were a number of candidates from the Haitian community, and it was, let me tell you, unfortunately, a savage race. In order to try to distinguish themselves from one another, some of them fell into the trap of really nasty personal accusations. It was one of the nastiest races we have seen. So with that background for our elections in New York City, considering ranked choice voting is an interesting choice. It is not going to solve everything we dislike about our elections. And I'm sure if we went around the room, a lot of you would have a lot of things you dislike about the elections. It doesn't address the money in politics problem, but it does, I think, give us interesting choices in the context of what people dislike, some of the things people dislike about the New York City system. And I think it's a matter of concern when we've got elected officials who win the primary, and let's be honest, in New York City, you win the Democratic primary, especially for city council, unless you're hit by a bus, you're probably going to be the elected official. So when that person is chosen with less than 30% or less than 40% of the primary vote, that's not as strong for our democracy as we would like to see. And one of the things which we've seen with ranked choice voting and talking to candidates and in talking to voters in other places is that the candidates have to change the way they campaign. And Carlo, I think, mentioned this. It not only tamps down, discourages negative advertising, it forces candidates to go outside of their base. Right now, with what we call first past the post elections, the winner takes all, if you're running for office, the consultant will tell you, figure out who your voters are and concentrate on them, right? There are activists in the Asian community who are very interested in ranked choice voting because they say if there is an Asian candidate on the ballot, candidates from other communities never come to talk to Asian voters. With ranked choice voting, the candidates do not have the luxury of ignoring other communities because you want to be ranked.
If I'm not gonna be your number one, I wanna be your number two and your number three. And how do you get to be number two and number three? By showing up, by talking to voters, to listening to what they have to say. Constantly people are concerned about the complexity, and that's why I really want you to take a look at the ballot. What we've seen is a really high degree of satisfaction, voter satisfaction, in places that have ranked choice voting. A low satisfaction rate on the post-election surveys is 65% of the voters who say that it was simple or somewhat simple to cast a ballot. It's usually in the 70 to 80 percentiles. Because, as I said, when we think about it, we instinctively rank. It's a natural thing that we do. What we're seeing is not an increase in the number of spoiled ballots, because that's an ongoing concern, right? That the voter is confused by the ballot, and that's happened, I think, to all of us here in New York City, where sometimes the ballots are not as well designed as they should be. And what we see is that giving people the ability to rank does not increase the number of confused voters. Unfortunately, it seems like we always have a baseline of confused voters. It doesn't improve it, it may not necessarily reduce it, but it doesn't increase it as far as we can tell. So what do we need to be aware of? I think we do need to be aware of the fact that the design of the ballot is going to be crucial for ranked choice voting. And we're gonna have to really be on top of our Board of Election to be sure that they design ballots that we're able to make sense of. That's a weakness in ranked choice voting, is that the ballot's gotta be clear. And that's in the hands of people who we may not have the most faith in all honesty. And also, for it to be used effectively, voters have to understand it. It has to be supported with an education campaign. And what we've seen in the cities that have adopted it over the past 10 years is that if it is supported with a good education campaign by the city and advocacy organizations, that there is a high degree of satisfaction with it. So I'd like you to take a look at the ballot, choose your favorite ice creams, let's hand them back in. Sarah, do you have them?
Yeah.
Great. So she's going to do the rounds. There have been some questions. How does it actually work on election night? Is it going to make the process of tabulating the votes that much longer? Our experience in other cities is that what basically happens is on election night, you will get the results of round one, right? And as Carlo said, if there's a 50% winner, more than 50% on the first round, election's over, you have a clear winner. If we need to go into the rounds, remember the voters have a choice. You can rank up to 5 in the crowded fields, or only 1 if you choose. So on election day, we'll see round 1, and we're most likely going to see round 2. The Charter Revision Commission made some interesting choices here in New York City. One, they chose to give the voters the option of ranking up to 5. And the reason for that is one of the things that Carlo talked about, which is the concept of ballot exhaustion. A ballot exhaustion means that you cast a vote that isn't actually counted in the last round. But when we think about ballot exhaustion, there are 2 things to think about. One, in these crowded fields, if we have a winner-take-all and you're voting for somebody who's getting a very low percentage, you haven't really contributed to the winner, and the winner isn't really feeling any accountability to the people who did not vote for him or her. With the ranking, the idea is that the elected will feel more responsibility to more people, not just the first choice, but the second and third choice. And what we've seen historically, in the last 15 years, we've had 3 runoffs in New York City. Each runoff costs between $11 and $15 million. But putting aside the question of how much they cost, there is a huge voter fatigue, I would say exhaustion, between the primary and the runoff. So, and our primary turnout figures are not impressive to begin with. But in these primaries, it was hovering somewhere between 25 and maybe 31, 32%. But the runoffs were getting under 15%. So you have we have a problem with voter fatigue, voter exhaustion, just too many races. So if your concern is that people are confused and tired of voting, then ranked choice voting is also, the other name, as Carlo pointed out, is instant runoff. You don't have to come back and vote a second time. Your votes are retabulated as if you were required to vote more than once. So the logic is that it saves time and it saves money. And it certainly is an interesting concept, as I said, for the things that we have specifically here. Why did the Charter Revision Commission choose only to use it for primaries, which, as Carlo points out, is a unusual choice? Here in New York City, we have, and throughout New York State, we have something called fusion voting. How many of you are familiar with the idea of fusion? Okay. So as you know, fusion voting means that the candidate is endorsed by more than one party. Now there are two ways to show fusion voting on your ballot. And because we're New York, we're exceptional, and we don't do things the way anybody else does it, we lay out our fusion voting ballot differently than any of the other states that have fusion voting. In Washington State, for instance, which has fusion voting, the candidates are named and the parties are listed under the candidate. So the candidate only appears once on the ballot. That's not the way we do it in New York. New York's election law is very party-centric, not voter-centric, party-centric. So for various reasons, each candidate appears separately for each party. So you can have the same candidate who will appear 2 or 3 or 4 times on the same ballot. So for instance, in this fall's general election, we'll be voting for special advocate. We'll be voting on the 5 charter revision questions. We'll also be voting for civil judges and Supreme Court judges. And often those judicial candidates are endorsed by every goddamn party. I guess you can tell how I feel about that. But that means that the same judicial candidate appears 3 or 4 times on the ballot. The Charter Revision Commission was concerned about confusion in that situation. The voters need to be educated about ranked choice voting and how to fill out the ballot correctly, and the Charter Revision Commission thought that trying to convince people not to vote for the same candidate who appears 3 or 4 times on the ballot multiple times was perhaps more of an education task than the city should take up on the first go-rounds with ranked choice voting. So they chose to use it for special elections, which are nonpartisan, and for primaries. There's nothing that prevents us from deciding that we like ranked choice voting if the voters adopt it, and adding it for the general election later once people are familiar with it and less likely to vote for the same person 3 times. Because you can't vote for the same person 3 times and have it count 3 times. That's not going to work. So that was why the decision here in New York City is to start with it for the primaries and for the special elections where you don't have the candidate appearing multiple times. It's been really interesting for me talking to people around the country who have adopted ranked choice voting, candidates who've run under it. When I first heard about it, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, and by the way, we've had a ranked choice voting or instant runoff bill in New York City starting from 2010, because the 2009 public advocate runoff was so expensive and such a low turnout that people were looking for an alternative, but it was only instant runoff for the citywides, because that's where we have the required runoff. And when I first started hearing about ranked choice voting, I must admit my first response was, oh, come on. There are so many things we need to fix about our elections here in New York State. we didn't have early voting then, we didn't have the possibility of same-day registration, we couldn't get any reforms, and you were talking about this quote-unquote exotic form of voting. What is this about? And what turned me around was actually two activists from Ulster County. What I found is that a surprising number of political organizations, not just the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, actually uses ranked choice voting to decide who they are going to nominate. So Alaska and Hawaii's Democratic parties and Kansas's Democratic parties use ranked choice voting to decide who they want to support for the presidential nomination. Utah's Republican Party uses ranked choice voting to decide who to endorse at the county level. And for the CD19 race in 2018, the Ulster County Democratic Committee used ranked choice voting. And that's how I heard about it, from two activists in that committee, and there were two older activists who I didn't think of as being very radical people. And they said there was somebody on the committee, a younger member who was really good with computers, and said, why don't we have 6 at that point candidates who want our endorsement, why don't we use ranked choice voting to figure out who to endorse? And they said that they tried it out and they thought it worked really well. So I started paying more attention to it and started doing more research and talking to people in other cities, and realized, and then we did the analysis of multiple candidate races, because I had the sense, as somebody who's voted in New York City for over a decade, that we have a lot of crowded races. Every time there's an open seat, because frankly, the strength of our campaign finance system, happily, a lot of people can run because we have public financing, a lot of community-backed candidates. But that means that you will get a primary like the one that Councilmember Keith Powers pointed out to me, that he ran in a primary with 9 candidates. So there is a reason why I think it makes sense for us in New York City to be considering this alternative. And I'd just like to end with one frightening thought. In 2021, 70% of our city council is turned out. The mayor is turned out, the comptroller is turned out, and all 5 borough presidents are turned out. So the conjunction of public financing and term limits means that we are going to see a lot of candidates. And in fact, our campaign finance board is predicting a minimum of 500 candidates for all of the city offices. That's averaging 12 candidates per race.
Wow.
And we may want to have ranked choice voting to help us make sense of those kind of crowded fields. So I think, so sometimes with the question, why did the Charter Revision Commission pick this up now? As I said, it's been under consideration for a while, and we have this really crowded field barreling down the track at us for 2021. And if the voters decide to adopt it, this general election cycle, which starts with early voting on October 26th and election day on November 5th, we will have enough time to have it in place for 2021. It'll be effective starting January of 2021. So that means that the Board of Elections would have time to upgrade its technology, because happily, it's just a coincidence, the election machines that we use to tabulate, to read the vote and tabulate the vote here in New York City are the same ones that are used in Minneapolis and Maine. So the vendors are familiar with ranked choice voting and know how to upgrade the machines, which we estimate will cost about $100,000, which compared to going out and buying a whole new set of election machines is kind of a bargain. So concern about can our Board of Elections handle it? The technology exists, we already have it, we have vendors who can upgrade it. It's the design of the ballot I'm worried about, and it's really educating voters so that it's not a surprise if we adopt it for this general, that when you're voting these huge fields in 2021, you know what you're expecting. And you are listening more to a multiplicity of candidates because you have the opportunity to rank. But again, it's the voter's choice. Nobody is forcing you to rank. You have the option to rank, but you can still vote for only one if that's what you're most comfortable with. So that's the background of sort of the research that we've done and the things that we have heard from other states, other cities that have it, and why I think this is timely for us to be considering. So love to answer questions. Again, as I said, and as Carlo pointed out, there is no perfect way to run an election. This, it seems to us, addresses some of the things that are problematic about New York City's elections, but it's far from a magic silver bullet, and we're going to need to keep working on election reform up in Albany to really get all of the reforms that we need. So, thank you. Questions? Yes?
In the post-election data,
Mm-hmm.
well, do they, in the states in which ranked choice voting already exists, do they break down how candidates won by
Yes.
first, second?
Yes. So what happens is what they do is they put up the results of the rounds. So election night, you'll see round 1, and if you need to go forward, usually round 2. And then over the next several days, depending on how many rounds you need, they post the results. So you see the transference between the candidates. That's the way it's worked in other cities, and we're certainly going to be working to be sure that the board is completely transparent. The other peculiarity about what the Charter Revision Commission chose to do is that we keep running the rounds until we are down to the final 2. And that was a suggestion from San Francisco. The most recent mayoral race, which London Breed, the African American woman, run, was actually a pretty close race. And the idea was that if you don't just stop when you first hit the majority, but you run down to the final 2, you have a better chance of more distance between the candidates. And what you want to do is elect candidates who have a broader base of support. You'll have a stronger result if you go all the way down to 2, so that's what the Charter Revision decided to present to us. Yeah, that.
What have education campaigns in other cities that have implemented ranked choice voting look like?
Okay, they've looked pretty good actually. And we're a little behind. I mean, there are some really, a lot of them are video, a lot of them are digital. There's some, if you go on YouTube and put in instant runoff or ranked choice voting, there's some really great explainer videos. Minneapolis has a whole bunch of really good ones. Santa Fe did a really, really nice job. They used animals. There are 3 or 4 from the Minneapolis races. There's one that uses plastic dinosaurs. It's absolutely hilarious and really clear. There's a really good one from Minnesota Public Radio that uses Post-its to explain how the rounds work. So you can see when you peel off, the Post-its are stacked with your choices, and you peel off one and how you redistribute. So it's absolutely, we've got great models. Maine has done a really good job as well. And the Campaign Finance Board, under the Charter Revision proposal, would have the responsibility to educate the public. But I can assure you that the various advocacy groups that have been out educating the public now, we're New York City, we're not going anywhere. And once it's adopted, all of us, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Citizens Union, and the various unions and others in the New York Immigration Coalition are going to stay with it, and we're going to be sure that we do the best job we can to be sure that voters understand it. So there's educational material right now for ranked choice voting in Bengali and in Russian and in Haitian Creole and in Spanish that's being distributed. There are evenings like this happening across the city to try and be sure that the maximum number of people at least know this is coming and have an opportunity to do the sort of balancing that Carlo was talking about. What are the trade-offs? is this the right choice for our city right now? So the most important thing is to know what's happening, to flip over your ballot and make your choice known. 5 things on the back of the ballot, tiny print, 7.5 font print, but every polling place will have a big poster that you can actually read. But I would urge you, find out in advance about these questions, because the way in which they're described on the ballot, sometimes you can shoot yourself trying to figure out what it is. Yes?
Hi, are there any common geopolitical characteristics among the cities that have implemented the system?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so. But what I understand from people who've been around during the adaptation is, not in every instance, but it's certainly true of San Francisco, I believe it's true of Minneapolis, it's absolutely true of Maine. There have been very acrimonious contests that people really disliked. And Maine is an interesting example, because if you follow the situation up in Maine, basically they elected kind of the pre-Trump Governor LePage, who was literally pretty extreme and pretty crazy. And he never won with even a plurality of the votes, but what happened was the Democrat and the Republican split the votes, and LePage got just enough to be elected twice, even though he was the choice. He was absolutely not the choice of the majority of voters. The majority of voters voted for somebody else, but because the vote split, they got LePage.
Have a plurality?
No, I
You
don't.
didn't have more than the other candidates?
Slightly more than the other candidates.
So it's a
but
plurality, not a
like-
majority.
Yeah, not even close to a majority, right? So you're talking about minor differences in the 30 percentiles. So that's one of the problems sometimes with first past the post. And there's no question that the thing that some people like very much about ranked choice voting is that you don't have to choose the lesser of 2 evils. If there is a candidate you really believe in strongly, but everybody tells you not a chance, they're just not going to win, don't throw your vote away, you can still vote for them as number 1, because you have your second and third choices. And so, and particularly in communities where more than one candidate is running from the community, there's a tendency for the multiple candidates to be told, some of you should drop off. There should only be 1 from our community. With ranked choice voting, you don't have to worry about that. In the Queens DA race, it was really interesting to me that 1 week before the election, all of a sudden, Rory Lanceman just pulled his name off. Now, I have no inside information, but my guess is that the machine, the Queen's machine, went to him and said, "You are cutting into Melinda Katz's votes, and we cannot have that. And if you want to work politically in our borough, you better get off the ballot." And bingo, he was gone. That doesn't happen with ranked choice voting. But again, as I said, it's not perfect. It's not going to solve everything. And so you need to consider, what are you concerned about in our elections? What are the things that you think this could address that you don't like? What are the things about it that you're concerned about? And make a choice. Come out early to vote on October 26th through November 3rd, or come out on traditional election day. And Sarah, it seems like you may have the results.
So you guys had some funny choices. I wish we could graph this. I mean, we could, but not right now.
I was gonna say,
It really goes up
yeah.
and down a lot. Like things, flavors have just a couple votes, then they lose all their votes, then they get some votes back. So after 15 rounds, Cookies and Cream won with 20 votes out of 30.
So interesting.
And the initial vote was chocolate was leading with 11. Cookies and Cream was right behind with 9. Then vanilla was 7. Coffee with 5. Pistachio with 3. Butter pecan with 2, and then 2 write-ins.
So on the second round, how did it redistribute?
So the write-ins left, and coffee got one, and vanilla got one. Then on the next round, and then on the next round, we took out butter pecan, coffee got one, and then there was another write-in. Took out the write-in, and that went to pistachio. So then we had chocolate still in the lead, but cookies and creams, the top ones were sort of the same. We had to take out pistachio. Those votes went to 2 for cookies and cream, 1 for coffee, 1 for strawberry. I mean, it just goes on. It was a lot of like up and down, like in some kind of weird flavors that have very few votes, but people who like weird flavors seem to really like them, so they went. Oh, and we had three exhaustive ballots out of 39.
Okay. So what we've seen actually is that the winner, what we have not seen in the United States, and I can't speak to Australia or Ireland, is we've not seen candidates who are the 4th or 5th choice all of a sudden winning. The winner is almost invariably in the top 3. There's one race in San Francisco where the woman who was the 3rd choice on the first round ended up winning, but those 3 candidates were each within a point of each other, so they were very, very close. In all honesty, in 85% of the races that we've seen, the winner of the first round is the ultimate winner. But again, the announcement is based on the percentage in the final round. So in San Francisco, actually, I asked the election administrator at a hearing on ranked choice voting in front of the Charter Revision Commission, when we were talking about ballot exhaustion, I said, well, what do you tell the public? Do you tell the public the percentage on all of the votes cast, or do you tell the public the percentage of the final round? And he said, the percentage of the final round. So the public's concept is this is somebody who has a broad base of support. Whether it's statistically absolutely accurate or not, the winner ends up being declared with a stronger base, which may be good for our democracy, depending on how you look at it. Sir?
Actually, I have one question for one of Carlo's slides. May I? But yeah, well, or you may remember it. Besides your obvious prejudice against Juventus, you had a slide that said something about increasing minority voting, and it wasn't clear to me whether more minority members would vote or that they would more often vote for their ethnic group. It was in the cons slide. I didn't quite understand your point there. Ethnic voting, excuse me. Ethnic voting might actually go up.
Yes.
Was that about more voting in smaller ethnic groups or more voting amongst their candidates, for their candidates?
Closer to the second. So typically, political scientists worry that the way we would like elections to be run is based on programs. We all do our homework. We study all the programs, all the policy proposals of all the candidates, and we choose. Very often, this process is very complicated, so people resort to shortcuts. One shortcut is, where is this candidate from? There's an election, I see Laura's last name, I'm like, she's Italian. I like Italians. And I'm just gonna vote for her because she's Italian. That dilutes the quality of our democracy, because I'm not gonna base my vote on programmatic consideration, but purely on identitarian factors. And it's not, Laura doesn't have to work that hard to make herself Italian. She's Italian. There's not much you can do. We would like politicians to work for us, to develop programs. And one concern that I have is that as the complexity of the ballot increases, and as the number of candidates potentially increases, this might become, voters might resort increasingly to this kind of shortcuts. Let me add one thing. So she mentioned, Susan mentioned the concern for complexity, and I would like to second that concern. So, of all these papers, of all the literature that I've seen, the single most convincing piece of evidence was discussing the effect of turnout. And there is a statistical effect of turnout. When you introduce these systems, the number of people who show up to vote goes down a little bit.
So
And
there's
my guess.
conflicting literature. There are the academic studies that say actually in some places it increased the vote when it was introduced, and I'm not
McDaniel's paper reports an average effect. The two things are not inconsistent with each other. So if over a sample of 100 cities, turnout on average goes down, that doesn't mean that some of them went up, and others went down. My guess, if I could replicate that paper, which is something that he doesn't do, I would actually control on the presence, on the amount of spending on educational, on outreach, because then you can exactly assess how
Right, if
public
people know
education.
about it and are intrigued by the idea of doing something different, then they're more likely to try.
I should also point that the effect is not 25 points. The effect is like 3.5.
Sure. Thank you for the explanation.
And if you want pros and cons on all 5 of the charter revision questions, the Campaign Finance Board has arguments for and against from different organizations. They haven't listed ours yet, but they are up there, and you can get more background and hopefully a plain English explanation of what the hell the questions are. We have a nonpartisan description of what each one is, and I can share an electronic version with Laura so that you get a better sense, as well as a background, a longer background piece on ranked choice voting.
So I think in the interest of time, we'll wrap it here, but thank you very much to our speakers. Mentioning charter revision, this is a ballot proposal. ABNY actually just recently held a discussion with Gail Benjamin, who is the chair of the Charter Revision Commission, and Carl Weisbrod, whose name you've probably heard all across the city. The video is live, it's on our YouTube page, it talks about all of the proposals. So if you'd like to be more educated as you head to the polls, either on October 26th or on November 5th, Election Day, please check it out, and I'm happy to provide the link if you need it. Thank you for being here today. Thank you again.